On today's Transport Evolved, a roundup of the Frankfurt Motor Show EV launches and plug-in hybrid launches. Elon Musk's planning his trip and he's talking about it. And record EV sales during the month of August in the US. They peaked at over 10,000 cars. Plus news from Nissan, BMW, Mitsubishi and more. Coming up next on Transport Evolved. Transport Evolved is sponsored by audiblepodcast.com. To claim your free audiobook from a selection of over 85,000 growing titles for your iPod or MP3 player, head to www.audiblepodcast.com/Transport Evolved. And by your kind donations. To make a gift to the show or to set up a monthly subscription, head to www.transportevolved.com. We thank you for your kind support. And proud to support Chronovirus, the latest book by Long Island author Aaron Crocco. To find out more and get a free chapter, head to www.aaroncrocco.com. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to episode number 165 of Transport Evolved, recorded on Thursday, September 12th, 2013. My name is Nikki Gordon-Bloomfield, and I am your sole host this week. Not unfortunately, Mark is off doing an industry event talking about audiobooks and things. He sends his best. And Michael, who was going to join us, unfortunately has been caught up in a work-related emergency, so he's not going to be with us today. But I have a great guest lined up for the show today. The best person, really, for auto show season to have on the show. The wonderful Mr. John Voelcker from Green Car Reports and High Gear Media. Welcome, John. How are you?
Hey, Nikki. I'm good. Thanks for having me back.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. So, what have you been up to? You actually helped break a story today, didn't you?
I did. One of the nice things being on Green Car Reports almost 5 years now is that people send us things. And I got copied on a tweet that showed a photo, a screenshot of a Facebook page of a statement by one of the bidders on Fisker Automotive that their signed offer was entirely complete and had been sent off to the U.S. Department of Energy for approval. This is a pair of German guys who want to buy what's left of Fisker Automotive, which, as the audience probably know, stopped producing its luxury range-extended electric car in July 2012 and is basically out of money now. But the challenge is that the U.S. Department of Energy has loaned them almost $200 million. They sold about 2,000 cars, we think. And so the DOE sort of takes priority and has to sign off on anything that happens to the company, which has actually not declared bankruptcy. But it's gone dark for several months now. And there are apparently these folks bidding on them. There were a couple of other rumored bidders. I'll be very curious to see if there's a price announced. It probably will be, because at some point someone's going to do an offer on how much the DOE, do a story on how much the DOE actually lost. But the rumor a few weeks ago had been that this pair of Germans who want to buy the company were offering $25 million, which is not very much for a company that had funding of more than $1 billion between private and public sources.
Do we think this is going to be a political nightmare for anyone who, who's been involved with the DOE if it loses? It's lost a lot of money. If it is sold specifically to someone outside of the US?
The answer is it will almost surely be a political hoo-ha. The DOE, I think, is somewhat more circumscribed on how it can conduct public relations than a private company might be. They might point to Tesla paying off its loans ahead of schedule, but people really only remember the losers. And if the DOE is going to be, in effect, providing venture capital, they're going to have some losers. So yes, I think it will be a challenge. One of the rumored proposals by this German group, though, is to take the production of the Karma, resume it, which had been done by a third party called Valmet, a private sort of auto subcontractor in Finland, of all places, and bring it to the States. So possibly there's an angle that says the jobs came to the States even though money were lost. I don't really know the substance of their offer. I don't know. I mean, politically, it would probably be smart to make the DOE whole, but if the rest of the owners get shafted, I don't know if they're going to sign off on that. So it's really a wait-and-see sort of thing. But we do at least have a little bit of news on Fisker, and I expect more in the next few weeks.
Now, John, there's an interesting, part of this is riveting, really, because Fisker's a really interesting case. Fisker is one of the few automakers that I can think of, startup automakers, that hasn't come into the marketplace and gone, we're going to do this, and then not delivered at all. They've come into the marketplace and they've delivered something, and then they've had trouble moving on from that point. But the other interesting fact about Fisker, which sets it aside from Tesla obviously successfully received low interest loans from the DOE under the Advanced Technology Vehicle Manufacturing Program. Tesla went very much its own IP. It had its own patents and its own sort of technology. Fisker hasn't to me ever come across as being a company that holds much intellectual property apart from the actual design of the vehicle itself. And we've seen, everyone from, Bob Lutz, for example, talking about putting a V8 engine in this car and moving forwards. Obviously, Bob's bid was unsuccessful. What are these people buying if they buy Fisker? What exactly will they be getting for their, was it 25 million. What will they be getting?
I think that's a good question, and really only the sellers and the buyers know for sure. One of the open questions for me has always been, how much did Fisker license? I'm trying to think of the name Q something, because when they announced their car, going on 5 years ago now, they said essentially, we've designed this wonderful body and we're bringing in this plug-in hybrid system from another entity. My bet is that they had to do an enormous amount of work on that system.
Quantum Technologies.
Quantum Technologies, brilliant, thank you. To make it useful for passenger automobiles. I think some of that came from military applications. And so how much of that Fisker owns, how much of that Quantum owns, how much is joint development, what's licensed, and so forth. Very much TBD. Obviously, they own the design for the Fisker Karma. They own the design for the not yet in existence Fisker Atlantic, their second car. And there seems to be some notion that, in fact, the folks who want to buy this company, if they can get out from under sort of crushing burdens of debt and ownership, feel that there's a small market for something that looks like the Fisker Karma. I think the question is, if the DOE is out of the picture, do you do a Lutz or something like that and say, right, this is an incredible looking, very sexy four-door sedan, the hell with all this battery nonsense, yank all that out and put in something fast. We'll see.
I think it's going to be interesting. I mean, I could see a future where both options were offered, which brings us really nicely onto, I suppose, one of the bigger kind of group stories of this week, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's been the Frankfurt Auto Show this week, or the Frankfurt Motor Show, as we like to say in Europe. Lots of plug-in cars being unveiled either as production vehicles or as concepts, but an unusually high number of those are what I would call prestige makes or luxury stroke sports cars. We've got the Mercedes-Benz S500 plug-in hybrid, which we've been waiting for 5 years now.
They had announced that, and they'd shown a car, I think, back in 2009. So, yeah.
We've also got the Audi Quattro concept, which harks back to 30 years since the Quattro originally came out. And I'm struggling to think that it can't possibly be 30 years, but yes, it is 30 years. Then you've got the obviously Volvo's concept car, which is a plug-in hybrid, which harks back to the P1800. And then you've also got obviously the Porsche 918 hybrid, which is a plug-in hybrid Spider, or Spider hybrid even. And then you've also got, of course, the i8 from BMW. So you've got a lot of cars coming to the marketplace which are plug-in hybrids rather than pure electrics. And the message that those car companies seem to be sort of sending out is, look, here is a car that you can use in cities with zero emissions and you can do your errands and not burn any gasoline. But look, we've got these lovely powerful engines under the hood. In the i8's case, it's less so because it's a fairly efficient 3-cylinder 1.5 litre with a turbocharger. And I think BMW should be given kudos for producing that engine and putting it in that car with a view to try and maximise fuel economy. But I think the others are kind of using the plug-in hybrid sense as a way of either getting round emissions and tough regulations for selling quotas of plug-in vehicles, or they are essentially jumping on the bandwagon that other car companies have started and going, hey, we can make a car with a plug too. What's your view on this, John?
I think there's a couple of issues here. Number one, these days, and I think these days is the last 2 or 3 years, pretty much any concept car that you put out there probably has to have a plug, unless you're making a point of some other sort of alternative fuel. Unless you are Lamborghini or Ferrari or Maserati or one of those folks, you have to give a fairly strong nod in your concepts to lower emissions and more efficient use of fuel. Whether or not those powertrains make it into the vehicles is a different question. I think I'd be rather surprised, should they produce the Audi Quattro, that the first one ends up with a plug. We'll see. Mm-hmm. It's in some respects, it's the way the product cycles and cadence evolved. It just happened that this was the show where the i8 was scheduled to be introduced. $136,000 two-seat.
Yeah, who's gonna go for that, John?
S500 plug-in hybrid. We've known this thing was coming. The Frankfurt show in 2013 is the logical place to introduce it. The 918 Spider, the $1 million, very, 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 very fast plug-in hybrid ditto. I think in some ways the cars that didn't get a lot of attention at the show that perhaps should have were the Volkswagen e-Golf and e-Up.
Yep.
The Golf is a global car sold all over the world. The Up is restricted to markets that buy mini cars or sort of A-segment cars, as the Europeans would have it. But those are Volkswagen's volume, and I put volume in quotes. Those are their volume battery electric cars. We'll see what their idea of volumes are. I hope they're closer to Nissan than Ford, but who knows?
Yeah.
And, those are the cars that will really have an impact in terms of numbers. Porsche is, I've heard Porsche has struggled to sell 1,000 918 Spiders. I think the S-Class doesn't really sell that many to start with, and a plug-in hybrid variant is going to be a fraction of that. The i8 will be a fraction of the i3 and so on. Mm-hmm. But I think it's important to end with the idea. It's not like you have tens of thousands of customers walking into dealerships anywhere in the world and saying, the hell with the gasoline car I bought last time, you must sell me a battery electric car.
Right.
These vehicles are being driven by regulation to lower vehicular emissions, create more zero-emission vehicles, and so on. And a lot of them are the first steps in a very, very long path. Volkswagen, perhaps inadvisedly, declared, not just sort of inside chat in the scrum, but actually in a press release, that they are going to be the biggest producer of plug-in and hybrid vehicles in the world 5 years hence. I think Toyota and Nissan may have some different ideas about that.
Yeah.
But it does sort of indicate that any manufacturer that considers itself a big global maker now has to know how to do this stuff. And
I think this is kind of like, it's almost like being able to do a certain in-car entertainment technology. It's become almost de rigueur for automakers to be able to throw off a plug-in vehicle somewhere in their lineup. I think Volkswagen is maybe deluding itself about being the biggest electric car maker by 2018. But let's talk nomenclature for a second, John. I know that this is something that you and I have discussed at length before. For those who don't know, John and I used to work together at Green Car Reports, and so we've had lots of after-hours chats about this. Nomenclature is very, very particular here. Volkswagen says it will be the biggest electric car maker. Now, from lots of Germans that I've spoken with over the years, electric car maker and e-mobility and electrified vehicles are all interchangeable. They are words meaning anything from a micro-hybrid system with a stop-start setup where there is, instead of a conventional alternator and starter motor, there is a combined alternator generator that can start the engine when you lift your foot off the brake and put it to the gas, all the way through hybrid, conventional hybrid, through the road hybrid, plug-in hybrid to pure electric. Now, John, am I seeing this correctly? Do you think Volkswagen means we will be the largest maker of cars with motors in them?
Yes, and the official statement actually was, the Volkswagen Group is, quote, setting its sights on market leadership in electric mobility by 2018, which means exactly what you said, with the possible exclusion of start-stop systems. But yes, on the other hand, Nissan and Renault together have sold more than 100,000 battery electric cars in 2.5 years. Toyota has sold more than 5 million hybrids since 1997. So it's not exactly as Volkswagen is getting a jump on them. But with typical confidence, the CEO of Volkswagen said before the show, quote, "We are starting at exactly the right time." So there you have it.
There you go. Talking about the e-Golf specifically, I mean, the e-Up is going to be an interesting car. I think it's got top speed of about 80 miles an hour. It's going to target, I think it's going to give the Smart for 2 electric drive a tough time because it's got 4 seats as opposed to 2, and it's got similar kind of performance and specifications. And to be honest, not that much difference in size. But let's talk about the e-Golf because it's got much more of a global appeal. Obviously, this one is built on the Mark 7, which is the MQB platform, which Volkswagen has designed from the beginning to be a cross-fuel type platform. So to accommodate any fuel type that Volkswagen chooses, from a traditional gasoline engine, right through to electric drivetrains, fuel cells, hybrids, or anything else that happens to pop up on the horizon in the future. Now, I've driven the Mark 6 Golf Electric, which was obviously a prototype. And the one I drove, I was told unofficially, was essentially a Mark 7 test mule. So it looked like a Mark 6 Golf, but it had elements of the Mark 7 e-Golf drivetrain. It's got this flappy paddle gearbox that allows you to really control the regenerative braking just by using your hands. On accelerator liftoff, you can have no regen at all, which is equivalent to the coasting that you could do in the old EV1, all the way through to very, very harsh regenerative braking, which automatically turns on the brake lights and simulates dropping a gear in a traditional manual gearboxed car. From my brief drive experience, and I don't know if you've driven this car yourself, John, it felt very competent and very well put together, and a typical Volkswagen in terms of fit, finish and trim and the way it was put together. The question now becomes, can Volkswagen go into the market and price it at the right price? And this is the thing we don't know yet. Volkswagen has yet to unveil a price. I think I was saying yesterday to a colleague that, if Volkswagen is serious about this car, it needs to go after the Nissan Leaf 100%. On paper, similar range to the Leaf. I think it's got 5 kilowatts more in terms of power output, a similar torque level, but it really does need to compete directly with the Leaf, which means it's going to be hitting the mid-20s, isn't it, John?
Yeah. I had, to answer the question, I had driven a prototype Audi A3 e-tron, which was a pure battery electric prototype, and had very much the same reaction you did. It was very polished and put together. It had the paddle shifters for different levels of regen, and it certainly was enjoyable to drive. I think it's probably still going to be somewhat disadvantaged by the fact that it's an adapted gasoline car. There are certain things that you design differently if you have to have a transverse engine and transmission up front compared to having essentially a smaller electric motor and some power electronics sitting under the hood. But I, too, will be curious to see where they price it. I'm not at all convinced that they are going to go directly up against the Leaf. I think as their first battery electric vehicle, they will probably do something like what Ford did, price it fairly high. They'll discover that if your price is sort of 50 or 60% higher than a gasoline version of the same car, you have trouble selling them.
Yeah.
And there's also the issue that having not sold cars with plugs before in any great quantity, there is a lot of the, I don't want to say soft stuff, but there's a lot of the non-product stuff that the dealers are going to have to deal with. And they don't particularly like dealing with that stuff. It takes longer. It's complicated. You have to get contractors. They have to understand new machinery and so on. So I'm expecting the e-Golf and presumably the e-Up to sell in relatively small numbers. I think in the States, given that Volkswagen is embarking on a new push to get preferential treatment for diesels, they're now talking about potentially selling vehicles running on natural gas. I don't see Volkswagen as particularly committed to plug-ins. They will sell enough e-Golfs to comply with the next round of California zero-emissions vehicle sales requirements, which kick into effect from 2015 through 2017. I don't expect much beyond that. So like many, many other cars, I think the e-Golf will be available to Californians, some of whom will buy it and really like it. The rest of us, not so much.
Yeah. Talking about garages and training for Volkswagen, a little kind of rat run of a story here. I used to own a Volkswagen Golf City Stromer, 1985. There was only 2 right-hand drive cars ever made in the whole of existence, and I owned one. It was supposedly a prototype that should never have made its way into private hands, but somehow it had. I think they made probably 800 or 900 left-hand drive ones in mainland Europe, but I had trouble with the brakes on this car, and I took it to the local dealer and I said, this is an electric Golf. They didn't believe that Volkswagen had ever made it until they looked on the microfiche and found the part numbers and then apologised. Moving on very quickly, we're going to cover this story before the break. This is one that I think hasn't really had much coverage yet, but I think will. Ford, the Focus Electric, which we just mentioned there, John, is actually now under official investigation from the NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, because it has received 11 complaints. It's actually received 12 complaints, but 11 for this particular issue, which revolve around complainants driving their cars along, and suddenly the car says, "Stop safely now," on the dashboard, on the left-hand side of the dashboard, and the car just stops responding. You can still steer it, you can still brake it, you can still operate the blinkers, but the powertrain stops responding. And so the only choice is to pull over at the side of the road, turn the car off completely, open the door, close the door again, and reboot the car. Now, Michael Thwaite, who was due to be on the show today, he was going to talk about this. He says that, Ford are looking into it. He knows that Ford are looking into it. He's got a Focus Electric. There are people having this issue. A lot of owners are trying to trace it. Do we think this is going to be another reason for anti-EV people to kick up a stink about EVs not being safe? Or do we think this is just teething problems of a new technology? Or is it somewhere in between? I mean, should Ford be given a pat on the head and said, never mind? Or should we be angry that Ford obviously has a problem?
I think it's teething problems. One of the things to put into context here is that over almost 2 years, I'm just looking on the wall at my sales chart here, over all but 2 years, Ford has not even sold 2,000 Focus Electrics. The car is nominally on sale in every one of the 50 U.S. states now, and they haven't even managed to shift 2,000 of them. Compare that to more than 10 times that number of Volts and Leafs. This is just not that big in the market. And I get the sense that this sort of reactive, electric cars, they're going to kill you kind of stuff, that's all sort of faded out of the media. With continuing numbers, with continuing sales, you still see a lot of coverage of the not selling as well as were projected
yes.
which is true. But I'm not seeing so much complete reactionary stuff. Also, no one has been injured as far as we know, although I think the problem potentially is more widespread. I actually had a comment. We did this story that's mid-morning today on Green Car Reports, and I actually had someone write in the comment, "Oh, I have one of these cars. It shut itself off in my driveway. I didn't realize that this was a widespread problem. I'm going to take it to the dealer."
Yeah.
So my bet is that's another one that wasn't among the ones that was reported to the NHTSA.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the case. And I think, as an early adopter, there is some reluctance sometimes to actually report things because you're worried that it's going to be seen as, your car might be taken away or whatever. And I think a lot of EV drivers do kind of think twice before noting. I mean, recently, someone in the UK with a charging station said, "Oh, please don't report that this charging station has a problem with the sheath on the cable because, well, I need to use it next week and I'm sure it's fine." Anyway, let's go and have our first ad break and let's hear what happens when you have a coronavirus.
It was supposed to be just another cargo run, but for Ken Mallory and the 3-person crew of the Raven, an anomaly in deep space changes everything. An unexpected turbulence shakes the small ship like never before, allowing a deadly virus aboard. One by one, the infected crew is thrown back in time to relive a near-death experience. Only this time, death may be closer than they remember. My short story Chronovirus is available for Amazon Kindle, Barnes & Noble Nook, Kobo, iBooks, Sony, and for all other devices and e-readers through Smashwords. Learn more about Chronovirus by visiting my website at www.aaroncrocco.com.
And you can also get it as an audiobook. I've listened to it driving a car back from Norfolk before, and it took me a couple of hours. And good audiobook to listen to. Quite scary at the end, though. Completely caught me unawares. Moving on, we've got the wonderful John Voelcker with us from Green Car Reports at High Gear Media. We were going to have Michael Thwaite with us. Unfortunately, he's been held up at work. And Brad Horton, who's just sent me an apology. He was our Volt driver for the day. Was going to come on and be on the panel. His internet's died on him, and he said he's having to call the cable company on his cell phone to try and fix that. So
his internet. I thought you said his intimates.
No, his internet. His internet. Or his internet, depending on your speak terms. Plug-in sales for August. Now, obviously, this is a story from last week. Mark and I weren't in the studio last week, so we didn't report on this, but I think it's just nice just to touch on it. 10,000 cars in August. That is phenomenal, John.
Yeah, and that's, to be clear, that's anything at all with a plug on it, from an electric Smart 4.2 all the way up to our estimate of Tesla Model S sales. We now have 2 cars. We don't really know the sales. Fiat have decided that they're simply not going to break out electric car sales from their 500 range, and Tesla is Tesla and need to do it. But somewhere between 10,000 and 11,200, I think, depending on where Tesla comes in, is the right number. And that's a level we've never hit before. And if this keeps up, sales estimates are looking good for the rest of the year. And perhaps with luck, we will cross that 100,000 plug-in vehicles for the year mark,
cool,
which would be about twice last year's.
Now,
I would point out a lot of this had to do with price reductions.
Yes, it did.
Pretty much everybody cut their prices. They lopped $5,000 off the Volt to match the incentives they were already giving to shift them, and so on and so forth. But it's not like no one wants them.
No. This has been the point all along. You price the car right, people will buy it, because it becomes financially a no-brainer. And I think people do prefer. Everyone I speak to who sits behind the wheel of an electric car goes, "Yeah, this is great." The only car that I think, perhaps with an exception, would be the BYD E6 that I drove last week. If you saw that show last week, I did say it was a 20% incline. It was actually a 21% incline, and I went back and I watched the video, and it took 11 seconds for the car to get from standstill to 10 miles an hour on a 21% incline. So I think perhaps that vehicle, luckily it's not on sale in Europe or the US, so I don't think we have to worry about that. Nissan NV200 is going to enter production next year. This car has taken minivan. What are we going to call it, John?
We're going to call it a small electric commercial van.
Okay.
For the States. There may well be a minivan version of it, but I think, small minivans have never done particularly well in the States to start with, which is why the C-Max ended up as a hybrid only. And so I think for the moment we'll see how many NV200 commercial vans they sell, period, and the electric ones will be a subset of that.
Now, you've driven one of these, and I've certainly had a look at one. Very interestingly, last week, when we were at the show Mark and I were at, we were wandering around, and Nissan had a stand, and they had some ENV200s there, and we said, "Are you doing test drives?" And they said, "Yes, we will take you around the track." And then when they looked at our badges, they went, "Oh, you're press. Yeah, we're not letting press in, but we're letting general members of the public drive it," which I thought was a bit bizarre. They explained that by saying it was still in prototype phase and they didn't want any negative press type thing. But it's taken Nissan a very long time to develop this car. Nissan says that it's been effectively ploughing back the feedback from all the test fleets that it's had and trying to refine the car and the van more and more and more to make it more usable. Also in Frankfurt, by the way, we did see the ENV200 taxi, didn't we?
I wasn't aware that we saw an electric taxi in Frankfurt, but honestly, with the volume of cars there and our guys running around like mad just trying to hit the big events, I could well have missed it. I know that there's a little bit of confusion on the NV200 because a stretched version of that is becoming New York City's taxi of tomorrow.
Oh, maybe it was that we saw instead.
A gasoline engine, and presumably a hybrid soon, and eventually an electric version of that. But I don't think we've seen that electric as yet. Driving it, it's interesting because last year, actually, when I went to Yokohama, Nissan did a sort of a tech display in Japan. They had the regular NV200 diesel engine version there. And I had sort of forgotten, or maybe never known, how remarkably slow European spec small delivery vans actually are fitted with diesels. The ENV200 is no rocket ship. The Leaf's not particularly a rocket ship. This is a taller, heavier vehicle with a Leaf drivetrain, essentially, especially loaded down with cargo. But it's certainly more pleasant than the really slow and ponderous diesel NV200, and I suspect a lot of the feedback they've been getting is from the fleet owners. This is targeted specifically at people who have what they call back-to-base urban delivery fleets. I don't know, think UPS or FedEx or DHL or whoever, or, your local package delivery or dry cleaning or whatever, where the vehicle covers 40, maybe 50 miles maximum every day, and it goes back to the same lot or garage every night, so you can plug it in overnight and recharge it. Because the running costs are so much lower for the fleet operators, and that's what they care about.
And I think they are intentionally depowering them. I think that's what I've heard, that the vehicles were too peppy to begin with. And fleet managers were saying, turn it down a bit.
Yeah, I could imagine that.
And it's worth noting that in Europe, a lot of delivery vehicles are limited either by choice or by design to 50, 60 or 70 miles an hour, depending on the vehicle type. So that's the other thing to bear in mind is, we are used to these slow, heavy delivery vehicles because they're built for torque and, getting the stuff around rather than beating someone off the lights. Talking of beating someone off the lights, Detroit Electric, which hasn't beaten anyone off the lights, essentially a wannabe Tesla Roadster, been promising a car for a long time. Sounds like some of the other automakers or wannabe automakers perhaps that we've heard about over the years, says that now the Detroit Electric will be built in Holland, not the US. I question whether this vehicle's ever going to see the light of day, John.
In all honesty, I think we give them about 10 seconds, then we talk about Tesla.
Yeah.
Because until there is a car for any member of the legitimate press to drive, they've got a pretty prototype, which is a Lotus underneath, which is fine. We've heard that score before. But until there are actually cars to drive, multiple development cars, they can talk all they want about where they're going to have a plant or where they're going to assemble cars or what they're going to do. Perhaps one day they will. Unless and until they do that, we're past the point where we need this sort of stuff for electric cars to gen up excitement. We got real electric cars for real car makers in the market.
Absolutely. Tesla, Elon Musk, been creating, as always, a lot of publicity about his trip that he's been talking about making, his road trip across America with his sons as this kind of big... It's almost been set as this big male bonding experience with his sons. Let's go on a road trip because that's what I did when I was a kid. And he's going to do it in a Model S, rushing across America using these supercharger stations. Now, John, earlier on this week, you did a story about how Tesla seems maybe slightly behind on supercharger installations.
Tesla had a set of maps on its website about the superchargers, showing what was live, and then you could sort of click through the seasons, summer, fall, winter, next year, and see where they say they're going to install superchargers. Perhaps not surprisingly, given that you have to permit each of your locations and contract with the owners and put in equipment and test it and yada, yada, yada. Each of these is sort of a custom installation. It takes a while. And we wrote an article saying, well, you've got about 10 days left of summer, and you've only done half of the ones that you said you were going to do, although you did do 2 that weren't on the map. And they've been expanding existing locations as well, sort of doubling the number of superchargers.
Right.
We got a fair bit of pushback on that article. Both the people who said, well, yeah, of course, they're never going to make it, and the ones who said, look, you ungrateful sods. They're doing something they've never done before. They're providing you free fuel. And yes, they're a little bit later than what they said. Lighten up. Which is, a reasonable point of view. The upshot of it all, though, having shot a note to Tesla, was that they took the summer map off their website about 4 hours after our article came out, which obviously means they read it.
Hell hath no fury like a Tesla fanboy, I think is probably the thing we can learn from this. Also, Tesla demanding the demand from Tesla could actually double worldwide battery cell demand.
This is actually the story that I'm most proud of having published, honestly. It did better than any story that we've ever published in 4.5 years in terms of traffic. And the basic thing is your laptop has 4 or 6 cylindrical cells in it, even though they may be in a sort of a brick-shaped thing, whereas a Tesla Model S has something like 7,000 or 8,000. And if Tesla gets to 100,000 cars a year, they're going to require essentially a doubling of all of the existing 18650 battery cell capacity in the world. And if they expect to get half a million of their Model Es, we're talking about essentially building building a battery supply infrastructure at a scale that doesn't exist right now, half an order of magnitude greater. And Tesla obviously know this, and they're seeing sort of what it's taken to get Panasonic to provide them the right quantities of cells. Panasonic battery operations have soared into profitability as the Model S has started to sell and be delivered in, thousands of units a month. Tesla are contracting with Sanyo to be a second supplier for cells, but Musk himself has said, if we're going to do this Model E car, the affordable $35,000 electric car in 2017 with a 200-mile range, if we expect to sell hundreds of thousands of them, we are really talking about massive quantities of lithium-ion cells in volumes that the industry can't provide right now. So we have to think that through. And we have to think it through now because of the lead time required to create cell fabrication facilities just to supply those batteries. But it's a fascinating issue. It's sort of as if, look back to the Model T. Once that thing got going in volume, although I believe Henry Ford built his own engines, but he sort of multiplied by a factor of 10 the number of engines that were being built in America per year. And we have to tool up for that.
And do we think we're going to see, we have to see battery factories in the US, I guess, coming online? Talking of which, interestingly, LG Chem, where the factory in Holland, Michigan, where the LG Chem factory there, where they're building the battery or the cells for the Chevrolet Volt and other GM vehicles. I think they may be being used in hybrids as well, John.
I know they're used both in the Chevy Volt and the Ford Focus Electric.
Right.
They're not in the Chevy Spark EV, and I'd have to go to my listings. But in any event, I assume you're talking about the EPA issue?
Yeah, the EPA went along to LG Chem and went, this battery that you're producing, these battery cells, would you mind awfully telling us the chemicals that you're using? Because, well, we're a bit worried that one of these chemicals you're using isn't properly registered with the EPA for use in the US. And LG Chem, in return, went, oops, sorry. Yeah, you're quite right. We're going to just shut the shop down for 6 weeks while we figure out the correct licensing, and then we'll start back up again. This is one of my stories of the week, John, and I actually wrote as a headline, EPA shuts down LG Chem, and a few hours later got a contact from the EPA, so thank you very much to that person going, actually, that's not quite right. We subpoenaed LG Chem for the information. We didn't force them to shut down. It was just that, as I understand it, it just appears that it was the next logical step for LG Chem because it couldn't make any batteries because it didn't have the right things it needed to use that chemical, low volume chemical. But it will be up again in a couple of weeks.
I give you credit for highlighting that story. It's the pushback on that was quite interesting, actually, because this was a case, I think, where someone at LG Chem either didn't know that one of the chemicals was there or didn't properly match the lists of sort of what's approved and what's considered toxic. Somebody basically screwed up on the paperwork, I think, will probably be what we discover. What surprised me was the ferocious level of sort of, oh, damn government bureaucrats. They don't know what they're doing. They've got their heads up their backsides. They're just trying to destroy electric cars. This astounding pushback. To which I can only respond that anybody who's worked in Silicon Valley has a very good appreciation of the long-term impact of uncontrolled chemicals from things like wafer fabrication when they get into the water table of residential areas, because there are swaths of very expensive homes in Silicon Valley that can no longer use wells or use or have to have their water provided separately because there's an enormous amount of contamination from the early years of the electronics industry. And I think the sort of reflexive anti-government, anti-bureaucrat reactions that I saw went a bit above and beyond what I would have expected from people, at least some of whom nominally are concerned about the environment.
Yes.
End of lecture.
End of lecture. I have to agree with you on that one, John. I was quite shocked by that. Anyway, just as an aside, by the way, more hints from Tesla that it might be looking at CHAdeMO compatibility for Japan. The headline that I saw reported said, Tesla confirms CHAdeMO compatibility for Japan. That's not exactly the case. Tesla spokesperson said, yes, we have looked at it and we might do it at some point in the future if it's right, as the market, deems fit. In Europe, the Tesla Model S is going to come with a Type 2, a modified Type 2 connector, which will give it capabilities to use a supercharger. It is entirely conceivable that in Japan we will see it as CHAdeMO. I think we can take that as read and move on to our audio book pick of the week. If you have never been to Audible before, give it a go. I haven't done an Audible ad for such a long time. I'm worried I'm going to screw this up. Audible is a great place to go if you want to listen to books being read to you while you're driving, working out, walking. I walk, I don't know, I haven't really mentioned this much in the past on the show. Those of you who are watching intently will know that I'm wearing a wristband. This is a Fitbit, and I am now walking somewhere in the region of 8 miles a day, walking the dogs, walking the kids to school, etc., etc., and it's helping me lose weight and all sorts of other good beneficial things. But listening to audiobooks while I'm doing so, when I'm on my own at least, is a really enjoyable thing to do because I can't write, I can't make phone calls all the time. So I'm learning, I'm listening, I'm doing my reading while I'm doing something else. And this week, the audio pick of the week, which you can get completely free by going to www.audiblepodcast.com/transport evolved, is Dodger by Terry Pratchett. Now, for those who've never heard Terry Pratchett before, he's a British writer, he's very funny, writer of the Discworld novels, and Dodger is set in Victorian London. And in keeping with Terry Pratchett, well, I'd probably play you a little excerpt, because it's best that way you can get to understand what Terry's like.
Said Charlie and his friend saw the face of a boy who looked like a young lad no more than 17 years old, but who seemed to have the voice of a man, moreover, who was prepared to take on both of them to the death. Anger steamed off him in the rain, and he wielded a long piece of metal. He carried on, "I know your sort, oh yes I do, coming down here, chasing the skirt, making a mockery of decent girls. Blimey, desperate, weren't you, to be out on a night such as this?"
There you go. And there you have Terry Pratchett. I do apologise. Halfway through that, one of my machines decided to tell me that it's someone's birthday tomorrow, which popped up on the screen, and also that there are updates available. I have yet to turn off the notifications on that machine, but there we go. audiblepodcast.com. Thank you for their support of the show. Moving on into the last section, John. We've got some interesting stories. It's a fun time of year, a strange time of year in the automotive world, because you get very little news and then you get an auto show and then you get very little news and then you start ramping up as you head towards the end of the year, as we head towards the North American International Auto Show, as we head towards Geneva and all these others. It starts to ramp up a little bit, doesn't it?
It's a very cyclical time. It struck me during the break, there was one little bit of news. Based on 1 week's data, this is finishing up our Tesla section, based on 1 week's data, it would appear that the Tesla Model S may in fact be the best-selling car in Norway. Not the best-selling luxury car, not the best-selling electric car, but the single best-selling model.
Period.
In terms of registrations. Now, they subsidize the thing every which way, and Norway is very, very serious about zero emissions transport. But still, people were sort of scratching their heads and asking Tesla, Norway, snow, cold, ice, reduced battery performance, what's this about? And the incentives there really are working. And the Norwegians, based on not a lot of data so far, although the first Tesla sold in Europe was in fact in Oslo last month, but it appears to be doing well, at least based on 1 week's data.
I think one of the things that you need to sort of add to that, yes, Norway's a fairly big country, but the population tends to live in quite in a quite small area geographically speaking. So while, at the northern end, as you're heading up towards the Arctic, you've got huge amounts of vast, barren expanse of cold in the winter, most Norwegians are not going to be doing 200 miles a charge and then needing to recharge and go somewhere else. I suspect their driving habits are much more European, where we might consider a 200-mile trip quite a long trip. Right. Most Americans will go 200 miles, yeah, we'll do that in one go. And in fact, when my partner first came over to the UK, I had a deuce of a job convincing her that we should stop on a 200-mile trip after about 120 miles, to have a little break, because the roads in Europe are not conducive to long-distance driving in the same way, because they're much twistier. Less people have cruise control. Most people in America now have cruise. You stick your cruise on at 60 or 65 or 70, or maybe even 85 if you're wanting to go over the limit, and you just get on with it, especially on the interstates. But over here, I think driving is a much more... it requires you to be a little bit more active more of the time, so therefore you get more tired more quickly, you stop more frequently, so therefore I suspect Norway, that range is not going to be a problem in cold weather, even if the Tesla's using more. Talking about Europe, Ampere and Volt prices have been reduced, which follows the US price cuts earlier this year. Kind of bittersweet for my family, because as those of you who know, we bought a Volt a month ago, just over a month, at the end of July. We bought a Volt. We've got less than 2,000 miles on the clock, and it was involved in a motorcycle accident a week and a half ago. I was driving, unfortunately. A guy came round the corner on a motorbike, on a little 125, and his bike went from underneath him is probably the best way of putting it. He went one way and his bike came careening towards me. I can't stop somebody else's vehicle from hitting me, especially if they're not, it's not being controlled by anyone. It hit the front of the Volt, it took out the charger, it's taken out the bumper, taken out both front wheels, both front tyres. We're waiting for the insurance company to get back to us tomorrow. Unfortunately, the guy wasn't insured, which doesn't make it any easier. But I'm now wondering whether that price reduction is going to make a difference to whether they write the car off or not. Because obviously, if the car suddenly got $5,000 cheaper, if that's going to make a difference. So we'll wait out and we'll see what happens. Social media meets charging. Now, I should put a disclaimer in at this point. This is a story, John, that you've covered on Green Car Reports. It involves a company called Ricargo, and Ricargo have a connection to Plug-in Cars, who I write for now as a freelancer. But essentially, this is an app that allows you to score your charging stations, your charging station experiences, so that other people can go, okay, that's a 5, that's a 1, that's a 3, and they'll go to the ones that are higher rated. Now, that idea in itself is not new, because the Open Charge Map's been doing this for years. The idea of you rate your charging experiences, and when I charge up publicly, I always rate my experiences from 0 to 5. It's a really good idea, and I'm glad that it's caught on with PlugShare, John. Do you think the early adopters will use it, the geeks will use it, the EV fanboys will use it, but do you think the average Joe in the street really wants to pull out an app and go do every time they have a charging experience?
I don't think so necessarily, but it's also possible that data might at some point get built into the app finder and the navigation system in cars, if it turns out to be solid and decent. We're in early days right now, and there are a lot of different ways to find charging stations. The map changes. I mean, it's pretty unlikely that a gas station suddenly pops up 2 miles from your home and you had no idea it was going to be there, but that can happen with charging stations. Eventually that will settle down. The rate of, and it's probably several years hence, but the rate of new stations will settle down. You'll be wanting to know more about, that one that I used frequently just went away. I actually liken it to city bike sharing.
Yes.
Where, in order to work at, New York City is still, I think we talked about this, is still sort of sorting out the launch of its bike sharing system. They have tens of thousands of bikes in lower Manhattan, and I had the experience that I rode a bike down to get my hair cut and went to the station where I was going to dock it, and the station had vanished literally overnight. Where there had been a station the previous day, it was gone. And so pull out the app, right? Oh, there's 1-2 blocks away. All right, fine. I think that will happen for a while. And, it's funny with electric cars, the owners get sort of caught up in it. There are always owners who are, I don't want to know about any of that stuff. I plug it in, I charge it at home, never mind about all the rest of it. But people sort of get that they're on the leading edge of an interesting wave. Many of them turn into evangelists when they didn't really expect to. And so they're going to have a higher than average interest in things like this app. And really, this is just adding a score. In the US, we might say it's Yelp for charging stations.
Yep.
It's just adding a score to an existing database of user comments and locations.
It's an interesting concept. Be interesting to see how it catches on amongst users. Moving on, the US military, when it isn't getting excited about or upset about Syria, is working on electric vehicles and using them as a way of storing and then distributing energy back to the grid. This is an interesting story, John. Smith's electric vehicles, and also there was a Boulder electric vehicle and a Smith's electric plug-in trucks. This is an army base in the US at Fort Carson. And they are using the vehicles to charge up from the grid, and then using that vehicle to feed power back to the grid as required. And of course, this could be used in any situation. It could be used for disaster relief. It could be used in a battle situation. If you're setting up a camp and you need to have power to to power all the communications equipment in a particular situation. So it's quite a clever system. But vehicle to grid is something that we don't think yet is going to happen in a residential stroke commercial situation, John.
So there's a couple of things. The military has enormous reasons for wanting to have more electric vehicles in its fleet. I remember reading maybe a year, 18 months ago, that in frontline situations like Afghanistan, it can cost as much as $500 to get every single gallon of diesel fuel to a forward base. So if you think about the tens of thousands of gallons that they burn every day, both increasing fuel efficiency in diesel engine vehicles and getting rid of diesel, both not only reduce cost, but reduce hazard to troops, because those fuel convoys have to be very carefully guarded, very heavily militarized, and people who are on the other side tend to know that they explode with great bangs.
Yes.
So the military loves the idea of electric vehicles, especially if there's some renewable component to it. So go to a sunny place like Afghanistan and set up your solar panels, and perhaps you can get some energy. Powering not necessarily vehicle to grid, but vehicle to location. Call it vehicle to base or vehicle to limited emergency only subgrid or something like that. But in effect, it's what Japan learned from the tsunami and earthquake, which was that an electric car is actually a very small portable energy storage device. And if you can get it out as well as putting it in, and it's mobile, then you have portable energy. So I think the military in some ways is the unrecognized innovator here, and they, unlike sort of retail vehicle buyers, are less constrained by cost.
Yes, and they do what is best in the situation as well, I think, is the other thing to bear in mind. All right, Mickey goes EV friendly with plug-in rentals for EVs in Orlando and charging. So going down to Disneyland, is that correct? I never get it the right way around.
Disney World's the one in Florida.
Disney World, yes.
This was a slightly odd announcement, actually, because they'd gotten a load of different entities together. And there are already quite a number of charging stations in Orlando, which is the biggest single tourist destination in the States, with all of these theme parks, not only Disney World, but Universal and a whole bunch of others. And it's a place where people routinely rent cars. They don't go very long distances. They go from the airport to their hotel. They go from their hotel to the theme park. They go from theme park to theme park. They go back to the hotel. So it's a good place to let people test out electric cars. And the goal of this is to bring all the players together. And there are a lot. There is Enterprise Rentals and potentially some others. There are a number of hotels. There are the theme parks and so on. I got some interesting pushback from my readers saying, many people have approached Disney over the years about putting in electric car charging stations in their parking lots and have all been rebuffed. We don't see an interest in it. We're not getting demand for it. We're not going to do it because no one will use it. So it will be interesting to see what Disney actually does in conjunction with this effort. But certainly it's a great way to get some people to test out an electric car, and they learn it's sort of an adventure on their vacation as well, going to do something they've never done before. And they can learn that, in fact, it does what other cars do just fine for lower ranges.
Yeah. And as a side, if you live on the Eastern Seaboard and you are thinking about going down to Florida on your holiday at any point and you have an EV, there's a really simple, easy way of getting there. You can take the train, can't you? From there is one train that runs, I want to say it's from Virginia down the Amtrak.
I don't know. I think it's called Auto Train or something.
Auto Train.
It's still running.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And by all means, yeah.
Yeah. In fact, someone on Facebook the other day posted a photograph of their Chevy Volt going in it. But it's obviously, presumably, a little bit more comfortable than taking a budget flight, and you get to take your car with you and charge up there while you're there. All right, let's talk Mitsubishi. Mitsubishi is in dire trouble. I'm going to call this now. Mitsubishi electric vehicle sales for last month, John. Do you have that figure there?
Well, in the States, let me just look here. Yes, they sold 30 of them in the States.
So that's 30 iMEVs.
And in fact, they've sold fewer iMEVs than Ford has sold Focus Electrics. They've sold 1,626 of them since they put the thing on sale, which is really just minuscule in the context of a U.S. car market that's running 15 million vehicles a year.
In Japan,
It's trouble in many ways.
In Japan, it's even worse. After the first 8 months of 2013, sales of Mitsubishi's electric K vehicles are well behind 2012 results in Japan, says Inside EVs. It's a 30% drop compared to 2012. Mitsubishi has only sold 1,169 iMEVs this year in Japan. Its home country, and even the vans are pretty abysmal as well. The question I have here is this just a case of Mitsubishi? It was the first, I think we can call it as the first to market. The iMEV came out a long time before the Leaf in Japan, in its home market. Not so much, in the US. In Europe, the iMEV, we had these test fleets in 2009. In fact, one of my friends owns one of those early test fleet cars. It wasn't compliant with the J1772 standard that we all now use for EVs. It has the right connector, but and so these cars are going around and being exchanged secondhand, and people are buying cars going, hey, it's got the right plug on it. They're putting it into public charging stations and the car's doing nothing because it doesn't actually talk the right language. And and to be honest, the iMEV is not a great looking vehicle. It's never driven that fantastically well. It's always felt a bit top heavy. It's not big enough really for the American market. And then when you compare it to the competition from Nissan Leaf, especially since Nissan's dropped its prices, Mitsubishi's dead in the water, isn't it, John?
Yes. I will say Japan is a unique market. 2/3 of the cars sold in Japan are these things called K cars, the very small cars limited on length, height, width, engine size, and power output. And 2/3 of all the cars sold in Japan are those. In part because they get preferential tax treatment, parking treatment, and so on. I assume the iMEV counts as one of those.
Yeah, it does. It does only in the Japanese version. So the Japanese version of the Mitsubishi i, both the original diesel and petrol versions, but also the electric version, has a smaller bumper than the European and even the American, obviously.
Right. And so I think in much of the rest of the world, the thing is just too small. And it wouldn't be such a problem if it were too small, if it were powerful or had range. But it is, in fact, the lowest range battery electric vehicle sold to consumers in the U.S. The rated range is 62 miles. When I tested one in New York City on a blistering hot day where we really had to run the air conditioning, I got more like 45 miles. That's not enough.
No.
And it's a very, very small car by North American and even really by European standards now. I think, in Europe, you've got the Leaf on the one end being made in the UK. You've got the Renault Zoe, which is a size smaller, being made in France. Those are real cars. The iMEV isn't quite.
Yeah, and that's the big problem, isn't it? I mean, I've been running a little bit of a competition this week with people. What car have I got sitting on my driveway this week? Last week it was the Smart for 2 ED, which I've come to the conclusion is overpriced. It's a fun car around town, but it's not good for highways. And this week we've got the Zoe sitting on my driveway. I've had it for a couple of days, been driving it. It is so much more the car than as you say the iMEV. It's got a much bigger load bay because it's very, very deep, very cavernous, and it's chameleon charging, where you can charge at any speed from 3 kilowatts right up to 40 kilowatts. Is insanely good, and it works, and it makes you forgive the car's other flaws, which is not very great trim, not very good finish in terms of it feels very tacky and cheap. But yeah, compared to the Mitsubishi, it's a fantastic car.
You are used to a Chevy Volt.
That is true. Moving on, though, and finally, we're on to our and finally story, John. How to get juiced up when you're a ways from power. This is a great story brought to your attention by the wonderful John Briggs. I hope he doesn't mind a name check. John, when I was working at Green Car Reports, was effectively my copy reader, and occasionally would send me the mistakes that I had made in an article that everybody else had missed. And he took some fantastic photos, John.
He still does that. I know you'll be happy to know. I still get tweets pointing out my typos. He took photos of a Chevy Volt parked on the street in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is the sort of progressive suburb right across the river from Boston, where the charging cord was plugged into the port on the left front fender, connected to a cord that ran through the car, so the driver's window was wound up to hold it in place. It went out the passenger window, so that window was rolled up, over about a 10-foot high fence, and right over over a power pole, and then over the 10-foot fence on the other side of the sidewalk, presumably into someone's yard where it was plugged in. I would like to assume that the Volt owner owned the house, but perhaps they just had a deal with whoever's house it was. And you know what? They were probably charging just fine, at least until some city public safety official discovers it. But it was, in fact, the cord ran right up the pole, and it was well above head height before it crossed above the sidewalk and over this fence. And it just points out that electric car drivers, especially in these early years, are enormously resourceful. I was amused many years ago. We ran photos of a Tesla Roadster at the Denver airport.
In Colorado, yeah.
The guy had squeezed it into a barely there parking space, which was probably where they parked the electric sweeper machine. But there was a 110 outlet in the wall, and he was plugged in.
I must admit, I went to visit I took my mum to hospital couple of months back in a local hospital in the UK, and I turned up and I was a bit low on charge. I didn't really need to charge up, but it was the difference between driving back at 70 versus 50. And so I asked one of the parking attendants if I could plug in, and he said no. And then I managed to convince him that I found the one 13 amp socket in the entire parking garage, and convinced him it was going to cost him like 20 pence to let me plug in. And, had this lead, a bit like this person, all the way around 3 or 4 parking spaces to the back of my Leaf. So I could plug in. So guilty as charged. John, thank you very much for joining us this week. I'm sorry it was just you and I, but I think we both had an awful lot of fun. Come back soon. What's coming up on the horizon for you?
Well, I've got a load of travel coming up the week after next. Some drive events. I'll actually, in a couple of weeks, be driving. It's not a plug-in car, but it is the most fuel-efficient, non-hybrid car sold in North America, the 2014 Mitsubishi Mirage, which is also the least powerful gasoline-engined car sold in North America. The reviews have been, shall we say, muted at best.
And talking about reviews, I think we should probably finish on the Model S reviews that have been coming in from Europe, because for those who don't know, the Model S has only just launched in Europe, the Tesla Model S. I got to drive it last week, as you saw in last week's show, and Autocar got hold of the Model S, and they did a group test against the Model S, a Porsche Panamera, and an Aston Martin Rapide. And my favourite quote of this article, which was shown to me by a Tesla rep, but I have to agree, said something along the lines of, the Tesla left the Tesla left the Aston Martin for dead, all the way up to 120 miles an hour, or something like that. or it just beat I can't remember the exact quote now, and I'm going to feel silly, but go and read the review. It's online. It was very fun. Thanks very much, John. Thanks to everyone watching at home. In a couple of weeks, we are going to be changing the show. We're going to be changing to a Sunday recording for Transport Evolved. We've got some new shows coming in the pipeline. You've already probably seen the first couple of quick chargers. You've also heard about our show Charged Up, which is a full after a week's worth of driving of a car, a full review of it, what we think about it, and also the quick charge, which is our first impressions after getting behind the wheel, literally after the car's just been dropped off. So follow those on the YouTube channel, which is Transport Evolved. We've got a new YouTube channel. You can follow us on Twitter. We are at Transport Evolve on Twitter, and you can also find the new website soon. I'm not going to tell you any more, but we've got a brand new website and it looks very shiny. Until next week, folks, thanks for joining us, and don't forget to plug in. See you soon. Take care. Bye.